Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Yellowstone Theological Institute in a summer session. And my name is Kurt Caddy. I am going to be the artist in residence for a few days, and what we're going to be talking about this evening is Kintsugi, and we're going to talk about the art of mending toward newness. And so tonight's discussion is going to be talking about the intersection of faith and art. So as a visual artist, a painter, photographer, ceramic Kintsugi person, I am very much exploring faith issues and how they intersect with the art that I practice. And so I have a Master of Divinity from Southern Theological Seminary. So I'm theologically trained, and I'm also a visual artist, a painter primarily. And so I get to bring both those elements to us this week, and so I'm pretty excited about being able to talk to you all about that. But tonight's subject matter is going to be related to Kintsugi, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But we're going to use as a backdrop the topic that we're going to explore this evening theologically is the topic of brokenness. Okay. Now, already, some of you are thinking, oh, great. Because nobody likes to really talk about that. We're not a culture that likes to talk about brokenness and how it impacts our lives. But the best I can understand in the world that I work in and live in and minister in, it's hard for us to escape it. It somehow always seems to find us. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because the scriptures talk about it a great deal. So we're going to talk about that and see how that concept, what the Bible says about brokenness, and then we're going to use this Japanese technique of mending pottery and see if we can't bring both those things together in an intersection of the biblical worldview and this ancient practice of mending pottery, and see if we can come to some conclusions about that. So we welcome you for the next several moments as we begin to do that. So tonight I want to talk just a little bit, give a couple of verses just to kind of lay some framework out there for you. Isaiah 61 talks about there's going to come a day when the Messiah is going to come and bind up the brokenhearted. Then you skip down to several more passages and he talks about how there's going to be an exchange, that you're going to be given beauty for ashes. And so it's this concept of a transfer of brokenness and ashes being transformed into something different, something beautiful. And that was actually Jesus' first sermon. He reads in the synagogue in Capernaum. They're giving him the text to read as the guest preacher, and they hand him the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads this text, this famous text of the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me to bind up the brokenhearted. That's the first words of Jesus' official ministry, which is quite interesting to me. And after he reads the entire section, he rolls up the scroll and says, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your midst." And then all heck breaks loose, and they try to get rid of Jesus because this is not exactly what they want to hear. So that's speaking already of the role of Jesus and the Messiah, the idea that this person was going to come and deliver them from this broken place. Psalm 51 is David's confession. We are pretty familiar with those. All good sinners know Psalm 51, right? We've all prayed this some point in our lives. We're like, Lord, I'm sorry I've done this thing again, right? So it's, my sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. And there's something wonderful about this idea that this God of ours who's created everything in existence has this capacity to not only be elevated to the highest place, but has the capacity to bring us, to reach into our lives, into our brokenness. So that's Psalm 51. Psalm 34 also alludes to it in verse 18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Okay, so just 3 verses from 3 sections of the scriptures that all talk about this idea of being brokenhearted and the role that it plays in our spiritual lives. So As an artist, one of the observations I've made in the last couple of years is that every creative process begins with brokenness. You can't make anything without something being broken. Okay, let's take something as simple as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We've all made that, and making is part of what we are. Whether you're a visual artist or you make peanut butter sandwiches or you make dinner or you've ever made an omelet, right? We make all the time. It's what we were created to do. But in that making, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Well, you go get a jar of peanut butter. Oh, well, how did the peanut butter get into the jar? Have you ever eaten a peanut? It doesn't look like peanut butter. What do they have to do to the peanut to make peanut butter? Well, they have to crush it, right? They crush it. And the same thing with jelly. Jelly is made from the juice of whatever jelly you have, strawberry or peach or grape or whatever, but it's made from juice. Well, that juice used to be contained inside of a grape. And how do they get the juice out? They crush it. Okay, so even a simple thing like that in the creative process is how it all starts. Everything creative that comes from us in making goes through this process of brokenness. Minerals are often crushed to make pigments so that you can make paint out of them. They're mixed with oil. Most oil painters now will use walnut oil, and you have to use extreme pressure and heat to get any bit of small amount of oil out of a walnut, right? So there again, we have this crushing and this pressing to get what's ever in it to get out. Fibers are pulverized to make paper. Linen is crushed to make canvas out of. I can go on and on. Clay is pounded to create clay, which is then heated into extreme pressures to harden it. Characters in plays or in novels or in poems are tested beyond measure, right? Lord of the Rings is not Lord of the Rings if they don't have to go through heck to do what they're doing, right? I mean, we understand that. But they're going to be broken and they're going to be crushed. They're going to be disappointed. They're going to be betrayed. And these are all part of what makes literature and poems so things that we relate to. A dancer's body will be broken over and over and over again just for the chance to make one miraculous leap. I mean, so here's this theme all through an artist's life is breaking things. Brokenness happens. It's happened to us all. The human art form, the human creation that God fashioned from the dirt was broken. In fact, we call that process the fall. Okay? And when you fall from a great height, you break. And their brokenness looks much like ours. When they're broken, they run and they hide and they're afraid. And then eventually they start blaming one another. I mean, we all know this story because it's the human story of how sin works and how these things happen. So the question for us this evening is, can something beautiful come from brokenness? A lot of ways to respond to brokenness. Okay, some people, brokenness makes them bitter, makes them angry. Makes them just put up all the barriers like I'm never going to be broken again, so I'm going to keep you out here. That's a couple of responses. Some people, they're just they just bury it and just let it go and then just do whatever they want to do to kind of overshadow all that. So they bury it and kind of try to overcome it through some other thing. And for some people have the ability through faith for their brokenness to create some kind of beauty in their life. And this is the goal for all of us. This is part of that sanctification process that we're in, is for us to take our brokenness and separation from God and to bring it into union with Jesus so that he can bring healing to our lives. So tonight we're going to talk about this in the context of Kintsugi. I'm going to show you a couple examples. Kintsugi is a ancient Japanese art form, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a history in just a minute. But it's basically repairing broken teaware with urushi lacquer and gold gilding. So none of that means anything to you at this point, but I want to give you a couple examples of teaware. These are a couple of handmade bowls. These are just pinch pots. So if you've ever taken a wad of clay, stick your finger in it and just keep doing this. Eventually, if you are patient enough, you can almost make it look like it's thrown. Okay, these are some that I've made. There are about 30 different styles of Japanese tea bowls made today. Almost all of them made handmade. So these are, you can obviously see those are different, right? They're different shallowness, different textures. So this one here, I won't attempt to give you the Japanese name of that, but this one is supposed to look like a mountain scene. So you can see the jagged edges there. They try to replicate nature as much as they can. And so those are tea bowls. They are prized in Japan. Some of them have been in families for generations. They're passed down. These are heirlooms. And so they're very, very, very important is the tea ceremony. Still today, there are Kintsugi masters that train for a lifetime to just repair people's teaware. And you have to do like 3,000 bowls, right? So I will never be one of those. So please don't mistake me for a Kintsugi master. I am barely a novice at this. And then there are also people being trained to be tea masters, where they perform the tea ceremony in their culture. So just a couple of things to just, I always try to juxtapose the Western way of thinking and the Eastern way of thinking together. Now, one of the things that we have to remember is when we're Bible scholars is that this Bible is an Eastern book. Now, when I was growing up, the worst thing you could ever say to anybody was like, you're an Eastern, right? That was an evil thing, right? Eastern meditation. We all remember this, right? Some of us that are in our 50s would recall this idea of Eastern meditation, all this kind of stuff. And the Beatles were coming over with this Eastern way of thinking, right? And it was perceived as very, very corrupt. Okay, so one of the ways you can distinguish Western and Eastern thinking is in thinking in terms of Western people are linear, right? We like to take notes. So that I go point 1 dash A, B, C, point 2. We make little outlines, right? We're 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3, right? We are very linear in our thinking. Something has a beginning, it has a process, and has an end, right? And in Eastern thinking, the mindset is more circular. So you can begin anywhere on the process, and you're moving through this process. So you never know quite when you're finished. So the book of Hebrews says that we are holy while we are in the process of being made holy. And all the Westerners go, wait a minute, you're either holy or you're not. And if you want to be holy, you go 1, 2, 3, right? We do that. And it's like, if you do these 3 things, then you can call yourself holy. But if you ever fail, then you're not holy anymore. And that's how Westerners think. And this is how we train people, right? It's how we teach people. It's why people are so confused all the time. Like, am I Christian or am I not a Christian? Am I saved or am I not saved, right? But the book of Hebrews says, man, we have already been made perfect in Christ. Hebrews 10:10, while we're in the process of being made perfect. So it's already done, and now you're in the process of becoming what you already are. Now, if that's not Eastern enough for you, I can get worse, right? So that's just an illustration biblically of sometimes our worldview doesn't quite match up, right? So what we try to do a lot of times is cram our Western way of thinking into this book, right? So we turn the Sermon on the Mount into a manual for Christians. It's not really what it is, okay? So lots of places where that happens to us. Another thing is when, first of all, I don't know if any of you have very many things in your home that you've had for generations. Maybe someone has their grandmother's wedding ring, or, we're fortunate if we can have anything in our home that went past our grandparents, right? And so I'll give you a chance to think about that. But some of these Japanese folks, they have things that have been in their homes for 20, 30 generations. but they have things in their home like a simple bowl from like the 1400s, right? So that's hard for me to get my head around that anyway, that you would ever keep anything. And they're not usually big things. They're usually small items that carry a great deal of significance to them. So that's one of the ways that this Kintsugi thinking is different. In the West, when something breaks, what's our first response? Pitch it. Exactly, right? Because first of all, it's probably not even worth the materials it's made out of, right? Matter of fact, we buy things so they won't break, right? Those little sippy cups with kids, we don't make them out of glass, right? Somebody get hurt. I mean, we don't have very many things that we have to even take a great deal of care with, okay? So we're often careless. Things break, we just say, yeah, throw it in there. Because it doesn't really mean anything to us. It carries more of a utilitarian function than any other kind of function in our lives. And we have very few things that are not completely utilitarian, even our cars. They're just like, well, because I drive old cars. Like, and when I drive an old car, you get to that point where you're like, honey, do I want to put $1,000 worth of repairs into a car that's worth $800, right? You're doing that all the time. And you realize you just drive it up to the junkyard and guy gives you $60 for it, right? And then that's what we do, okay? So our first thought is to just throw something away. In the Japanese way of thinking, if something were precious to them, they would save those pieces. Particularly in the case of a Kintsugi, they would save the pieces until they could afford to take them to a Kintsugi master to put them back together for them. Okay, so it was a very important process to them, not something that could be replaced. If we decide to, let's say my mother collects blue willow dishes. I don't know if you know what blue willow dishes are, but they're blue and white. They got really fancy patterns on. My mother's been collecting them for years. And she had one when I was a kid that broke. And it meant a lot to her, so she didn't throw it away, right? So she went to the store, because we didn't have internet then, right? You just went to the store, what kind of glues will work, And what my mother was trying to do was to make it look like it had never been broken before. Well, of course she was disappointed by the results, because she was the one repairing it, so she knew exactly where the break was. She said, I can still see the lines, and it's driving me crazy. So she ended up eventually throwing it out. Okay, now just to give you a difference, in Kintsugi, the idea of a broken vessel is to not only repair it, but to actually repair it with materials and in such a way that it's more valuable having been broken than if it had never been broken before. Now let me say that again, because that's pretty crucial. Okay, that's a significant difference in how you view life, okay? So this bowl, I had a student throw it on a wheel for me and glaze it. I bought it from him, and then I intentionally broke it, okay? But this bowl, because of that process, now imagine if this bowl were 300 years old and belonged to one of my ancestors, right? And then it's going to be very, very important to me, okay? And then you start piecing it back together. We're going to show you some of that in just a minute, but the idea in Kintsugi is that this is more valuable having been broken and put back together than if it had never been broken before. So Kintsugi bowls repaired are some of the most precious and valuable pieces of teaware around. So that's some of the background for Kintsugi. Let me give you a little history. Okay, not too much, but just a little bit of Kintsugi history because I do find it fascinating. Kintsugi was refined out of the Japanese tea ceremony culture of the 15th and 16th century. So this is pretty ancient practice. There's a famous tea master, probably the most famous tea master in Japan history is Sen-no Rikyu, and he developed an aesthetic and a philosophy based on the idea of wabi-sabi, which is a really fun thing to say, right? And maybe you've run across that, some of you in just being around, you'll see people refer to this wabi-sabi, and people are like, what is that talking about? Well, it's an aesthetic. It's a way of thinking about what is beautiful, Okay, and so for wabi-sabi, beauty is something that's not perfect, right? They value things that are not completely perfect. They're genuine or real, we might say, right? The real deal. So like this bowl is not perfect. It doesn't have a flat top to it. It's not perfectly round, right? And all of them aren't uniform in exactly the same way. Okay, they were made by somebody's hand. Okay, so these are seen as imperfected, and so you build that into it. So this one actually has a top, and it's supposed to look like waves, right? So it doesn't look like these, right? See, this one's been thrown on a wheel, so it's straight on the top and fairly uniform among these bowls, right? So my friend's a pretty good potter, right? If you're looking for uniformity, then that's pretty important. But wabi-sabi says it doesn't have to be perfect, because nothing really is in nature, right? Nothing really in nature is really perfect. You never see lollipop trees, and when you do, they look weird, don't they? They look odd, like somebody really trimmed that to look. They don't look that way. Okay, it's also a value of things being impermanent and that they have history, that they've gone through a process. For example, for people that love the wabi-sabi, rust. Right? Rust is a beautiful thing. All right? They just love like a piece of, and I see a lot of it in Bozeman. Lots of it. All these buildings are using steel now, and they don't put a coating on it. It just rusts. Right? Because people like that kind of aesthetic. It shows the passing of time, and it's incomplete. There's a famous Japanese poet that said that a cherry blossoms, it's most beautiful when it's falling to the earth. Now that's a different way of thinking about things, right? That whole process from the time it opens up to its bloom and full color to it falls to the ground and becomes part of the dirt is all to them a beautiful process. So that's some of the aesthetic that goes behind wabi-sabi and the Kintsugi process. So where did it come from? Well, there's a couple of stories. One story is about Yusei Hasakawa, who's a tea master preparing a ceremony for a warlord named Hideyoshi. Okay, so you got to understand a warlord, and then this tea ceremony guy. He's got this big, person coming in, an important person doing a ceremony. And during the ceremony, one of the servants of the warlord dropped his favorite tea bowl. Okay, broke it into 5 pieces. The instructor, the warlord, was infuriated, and he was lifting his hand to strike this servant for being careless with something that was really important to him. And so before that could happen, the tea master, Hasakawa, intervened, and he kind of jumped in the way and started singing a song, which is just like, think Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid. This is what I always envision in my mind. So he's this big warlord's about to crush the servant, and he intervenes and starts singing a fairly famous Japanese song. But rather ingeniously, right in the middle of this song, he changes a lyric. So it's a song that the guy would have known, and he changes the lyric, kind of does a play on words. I don't have it written down, but it's a change of words, which really implied that this tea master wants to be blamed for this person's carelessness. He's willing to take the fall for him. So if you want to punish somebody, punish me, your old friend. It's kind of the play on the words there. And so the intervention happened, and so he took full responsibility for what had happened. So the bowl was broken, so he wanted it to be repaired. And so this tea master in the 14th, 15th century got all the people together and said, hey, we got to come up with a process to fix this bowl. And so the theory is that that's kind of where it came from. The bowl was put back together and presented to the warlord, who was moved by the beauty of the piece. And so that story's become pretty famous in Kintsugi history. Another anecdote, so the very concept behind the art, and every artist has some concept they're working with. They're trying to say something to you, right, through what they're doing. through any kind of art form. Matter of fact, there's a famous idea that there's a dancer who did this incredible dance, and afterwards of one of the members of the audience came and said, what were you trying to say? And the young lady said, well, if I could say it, I wouldn't need to dance it. And a lot of artists are this way. We're dealing with pretty heavy concepts like brokenness, hurt, pain, sorrow, all these glory, honor, right? Praise. I mean, these are all big ideas that we're trying to somehow get a handle on. So conceptually, the Kintsugi was birthed out of compassion. If this story is true, then what moved the artist wasn't to fix the pot. To fix the pot was just a symbol of him intervening and willing to sacrifice himself and show mercy and compassion for this person who'd made a mistake. So even right from the beginning, we already see elements of this Christ-like way of thinking. Compassion, mercy, sacrifice, being sort of in play at the very beginning of the Kintsugi refinement. Another anecdote talks about Shogun Ashikawa broke a bowl. He's a shogun, so he's even more powerful than a warlord. But he broke a bowl, and he gathered up the pieces and sent them to China, because there's some history that shows that the Chinese have been doing some type of pottery repair since the 10th century. Okay. Now, when they first started, obviously, it's a little bit different than what it's been refined to. So it moved from China to Korea, and from Korea to Japan. And all along this process of moving from country to country, the Japanese were the ones that actually refined the process to what we understand it today. But he sent it off to China, and when it came back, it was put together with metal staples. And he said, the shogun said, this is hideous. It looks like a locust riding a horse. And so that bowl, they still have it in some museum somewhere. They call it that, the locust riding a horse. And that's the name of it in Japanese. I don't know what the word is, but it's still around, and it is ugly. It's just like they just drilled little holes and stapled it together, like put some kind of sap on it and sent it back to him, and he was infuriated. He was like really mad about it, but there's always been tension between those people anyway, so it just gave him one more reason not to like the Chinese. But so he just put out the word, we have got to find a better way. And so he gathered all these people who was wealthy enough to be able to do the process. So that's some of the history, and I find it to be pretty fascinating history. So let's talk a little bit about some metaphors, and then I'm just going to show you real briefly as I talk about this. So pretty much some meditations about the Kintsugi process and things that I've kind of learned through it as I've learning how to do it. First of all, brokenness happens. Okay, sometimes brokenness is an accident. You've heard your kids say to people, I didn't mean to. Well, I always say, well, you didn't mean not to either, right? You were careless with your words, with your actions, with your response. We've all done it. We've said things we wish we hadn't said. We just were in the heat of a moment, we hurt somebody. Because human beings are profoundly good at this. We're profoundly good at hurting, and we're profoundly good at being hurt. It's kind of the human response that we have. Sometimes it's intentional, okay? But we do have a universal human condition of brokenness and fallenness, okay? And it goes back to Genesis 3, when humanity made a decision to decide to be their own God, and then you get into all these problems, and it doesn't even take long. That happens in Genesis 3 and Genesis 4. We have the first murder, and it's been pretty much downhill since then. So brokenness is not a secret. And the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, begins with the awareness of our own personal brokenness. Okay? Now, this is an interesting idea, because we spend so much time talking about admitting you're a sinner. I mean, there might be a better place to start. Admitting that you're broken. I don't usually have any trouble getting human beings to realize we live in a broken world. I could go out on the streets of Bozeman today walk up and down the street and say, hey, do you think the world is a broken place? Or how would you describe the world today? And somebody, man, it's messed up. I mean, hardly anybody's going to tell you it's in great shape and we're doing great. Hardly anybody would say that. So maybe if we begin the gospel evangelizing with that idea, do you know what it's like to be broken? Yeah, well, where do you suppose that comes from? It's got to come from somewhere, because we wouldn't intentionally do it to ourselves. We just wouldn't do that. So it's got to come from somewhere. Now we can have a discussion, right? Instead of putting sin at the front and alienating everybody, we talk about the results. And then we can talk about why that happens. And then we can talk about the solution, which also included, quite interestingly enough, brokenness. The very communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, whatever we want to call it, the elements themselves, symbolic bread of the body of Jesus. He says it. This body is going to be broken for you, right? And how did you make bread? You grind wheat, which was once a living thing. And it has to give up its life and be crushed and mixed and then heated and made into bread. And how do you make wine? You crush grapes, okay? Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, was a place where they crushed the grapes. Interesting enough, Jesus, the night before he dies, is in Gethsemane, and he's sweating drops of blood. He's being crushed. The crushing was already happening. So we have no redemption. We have no redemption without brokenness. Okay? It is a story of how his particular brokenness covers humanity and brings healing to us, which then gives us the opportunity to, as we're going to see in a minute, connect with the new creation and have the capacity to do the same thing. So, that's something. Now let me show you a little bit about brokenness. Is always an abrupt process. A lot of times I'll have people bring bowls in that have been broken, something they've broken on their own. Sometimes I provide bowls. So, but almost always in a seminar, there comes a point where we have to break something, and usually I put it in a Ziploc bag. Do you know why I put it in a Ziploc bag? Because I'm not very good at keeping up with the pieces. Okay. Matter of fact, one of my Kintsugi bowls, I named them all. One of them is called God Holds All the Pieces, right? Because he doesn't have any trouble keeping up with my pieces. But sometimes I do, especially some of them. So anyway, one of the things we do in the seminar is we'll start by breaking a piece, and it's okay. Sometimes it's louder than that, but it's always an abrupt process. I always hear in the audience, because all the bowls in some ways are beautiful, they're unique. You think, oh, I'd like to have one of those, and maybe I'll give you one. I mean, but it's so when you see it broken, even if you feel something with it when it breaks. This particular bowl I did in the series. Is probably the most difficult bowl that I've mended. This piece represents the new creation. Okay, so our brokenness becoming ultimately beautiful, all things new. But I made a mistake on this in some ways. I put this in a Ziploc bag because I'd learned my lesson in that way. But I took it to my bathroom, which has a ceramic tile. And I was just holding this bowl, and I had it in the bag, and I dropped it. And as soon as I dropped it, I thought, oh, good Lord, what have I done? Right? Because I don't even remember how many pieces are there, but there are numerous. You can see some very, very, very small pieces. And this one took me weeks just to be able to put the pieces back in such a way that I didn't, as we like to say, paint myself in a corner. Right? Because if you don't put the pieces back in a strategic way, you can't get the last 2 or 3 pieces in there. You understand what I'm saying? So you have to find all the pieces. You have to sort of put them together, but then you have to put them together in a way that lets you build it all the way to the end. So it's it's a pretty elaborate, that part of the process takes the longest, just figuring out what in the world, how am I going to put this together? But when you break something, it makes an awful racket. It's abrupt. And it seems like in my life, one of the things I've learned through this process is that's how it always seems to me. I hardly ever feel that I'm prepared for the brokenness that I have to experience. It's almost as if every single time I say, I didn't see this coming. And I run into people all the time who say exactly the same thing. It's like there's no amount of preparing for it. Like you think, oh, I saw that coming for a long, because if you do that, then you're living like this the whole time, right? Now we have concerns and we have some signals that usually after the circumstance breaks or explodes, whatever the context is, then we look back and we go, oh, I should have seen that coming, right? But you may not have been able to prevent it, which is its own little bit of brokenness, isn't it? Because we do that. As parents, as people that care for other people, we see them going in a direction where we want to keep them safe and we really can't do it. And it's very frustrating for us to do that. So if you've been around people at all, you understand that. So the first thing you do when you're doing this is you're gathering pieces. And you can see there's fragments here. Okay? Now some of these will be able to be put back into place. But at some point I have to make some decisions. So you use your clues when you're putting things back together, whether you're helping somebody or putting a bowl back together or just trying to work through things. You get the clues, right? I know that that's round and that's round. It's like, okay, that's the stuff. And when you rub these things together, you can feel them come together. And they just kind of like, all of a sudden it's like, boom, they're there. And you can feel them kind of catch in there. And usually what I try to do is get the bigger pieces and I look for clues. Now I'm not going to do all of this, right? I'm looking for that one right there. But you get the idea, right? So what I will do is we take the modern technology allows me to take super glue gel and I'm able to apply that to this piece. Now in actual Kintsugi, they would use Japanese lacquer. And the reason that we don't do that is, one, it's cost preventative. It's an expensive lacquer. It's made from poison sumac. So it's not, you can't really use these items afterwards because they're made with something that's poison. And it can take up to 2 years to actually cure and dry. And people in the West, like myself, are just not nearly that patient. Like, so for me, all I want to do is just my 10-second super glue. And when I get in a real hurry, you can activate super glue and harden it by breathing on it, because it's activated by humidity. So if you're in a highly air-conditioned room and in a dry, you can just kind of, which is interesting. Because what is the New Testament word for spirit? Pneuma, which we get the word pneumatic from, which means breath or air. Isn't that funny? So even sometimes we have to invite the Spirit to breathe on us. Matter of fact, I would say we always have to invite the Spirit to come and breathe on us. And without Him activating these processes in our lives, it's really a no-go. So then I would begin to work my way through that process with the rest of these pieces, which I will do at another time. Let them finish. But here's one that's been processed, and you can sort of see the glue lines here. This one was broken into three pieces. So there's the main piece and then two other ones. But I have decisions to make as an artist about what I'm going to do with these gaps. All right, so you can see there's some gaps where some pieces where I've chosen to leave them out because I will use another product to make like a paste that's going to fill those gaps. Okay, and that's where you get into situations like these big pieces like that, right? So that I left that intentionally open and then made a piece for it. And that's just a decision that the particular artist has to do. Then you have other decisions to make. For example, I'm very fond of very, very smooth Kintsugi. This is another bowl, but you can see these are very, very fine lines that are made. You don't hardly see any rise coming out of it. And then other choices that you can make. There's actually a process by which you build up the line with other lacquer. So it actually looks like you've taken a whole bunch of glue and squeezed it out. And that's another technique, and it's just a matter of preference as to what you like to do. And then after this process is done, you can chip all this old glue off with a tool, like an X-Acto knife. You can scrape all the excess glue off, and then you take some very fine sandpaper, 600 grit, and you get a little water, and you just start sanding. Slow, trying to get that as smooth because you're trying to create that smooth finish. And so if you took one of these bowls, you can come through here and you can feel some places there's hardly any, you don't feel any bump in it at all. But takes a lot of time to do that. That's where the patience comes in. People get really tired, like, oh, I'm tired. Is it good enough yet? We just don't really like to be that patient. So then after that's completed, that process, then we take these two things. And this is a rushi made in Japan. This one is actually made from cashews. So unless you find those kind of products, nuts, toxic, you can actually use these bowls again. Okay, so I'll take some of this urushi, which is a lacquer, and I will mix it with powdered metal. In this case, this is brass, extremely powdered brass. Maybe I'll show you a little bit of that because it's worth seeing, I think. But it's so powdery. Yeah, I can show you a little bit of that. But you can see how fine that I can literally get it on my finger. And so it's very, very, I don't know how they grind it, but it's actually brass, powdered. Now you can get gold, and it's extremely expensive. Okay, so I haven't actually had the fortunate ability to do actually a bowl in gold, but the brass is a very, very good alternative, and it's fairly affordable for most people to do. So what I'll do is I'll mix up this urushi lacquer about 50-50 with the amount of powder, and then I'm mixing it into a paint. I'm making a pigment out of that, and then I take a very, very fine brush and I do what the Kintsugi folks call line work. Now I'm doing line work. And again, you can make your lines extremely fine. Some of these lines are very, very fine, hardly, like there you can hardly see the line at all. Or you can be very bold in your line work. Okay, so you get to make some choices. Now, what I just showed you sort of in a small demonstration in a workshop takes about 2.5 to 3 hours to do that. Now, a piece like this, I probably have 45 hours in a piece like this one. And let me just say a little bit of it. These are timbaku boxes, and they are made specifically to hold the bowls while they're being transported. So when I brought those up here from Missouri, I brought them in those. They protect the bowls. So those are also a process. So again, it's a very beautiful process. So let me give you some more. I talked to you about how brokenness happens, and then I broke something for you. Again, it always seems to be very abrupt, and God understands that. And he understands that beauty can come from the brokenness. If we remember the woman who anoints Jesus' feet, right? She comes into a banquet, they're having a banquet, she kind of interrupts, creates quite a stir because she's doesn't have the best reputation in the world, and so she comes and she's overcome with her love for and thankfulness and gratefulness to Jesus that she takes this an alabaster box. Okay, so it's a bottle made of alabaster, which is a stone. Okay, and alabaster doesn't absorb outside entities, so the things that are in it are pure, and the only way that you can get it open is to break it. There's no caps. There's not like a cork or anything. It's made for usually one of two purposes. It's usually either made for burial, for that person's burial, or it's made for the woman's wedding night. Okay, it's a beautiful ointment. So those are what it would be used for. So she comes up with this very expensive, imported probably from India, if you can imagine, and she breaks it. And when she does, it's only then that the essence of the oil comes out. And then she anoints Jesus' feet with it. And of course, there's a huge scandal, right? Jesus is like, oh my God, really? This money could have been, right? We all know this story. But I want to illustrate it's the idea of that brokenness. Without that broken part of it, and this was a very broken person, right? So we see brokenness at that level. So what do we do with our brokenness? Well, we have some options. We can be people that's just throw it away. Just it's not worth messing with. Just let it go, right? Has Disney not taught us this? Let it go. Just let it go. Right? We and there's a part of that resonates with us. Oh, we should just be better than that, and don't let things get to you, and it shouldn't bother anybody, you know. So, but that's not always usually the best way to do it. Just get another one. We often do this in relationships. I've watched this. I work on a college campus, and so I see it. It's like, oh, this relationship didn't work. Oh, let's get another one. Right? Get another one, and get another one, and get another one. And the same kind of things keep happening, right? So we keep doing the same things, hoping it's going to get better. Some people are notoriously good at hiding their brokenness. They're very good. Like you can barely see the cracks at all, right? And they put themselves only in positions where they don't have to ever be exposed, right? They don't have friends like that. They don't mix around. They don't ask people questions like that because they don't want anybody asking them questions. So it's like, I'm just hiding it. And they become very, very good at it. But slowly, it usually eats away at the interior of a person. But there's also the option of, is it possible that something beautiful can come from something broken? And I would suggest that Kintsugi helps visualize that, okay? It just does. For me, it's just showing that this bowl could have been thrown away. It could have been thrown away. But instead, it was mended in such a way that it's beautiful in its own way. And you clearly know it's broken. I mean, there's no mistaking it, right? There's no hiding it. There's no acting like it never happened. It's saying that it's a recognition that there's something, it's possible for something beautiful to come from something broken, which is exactly what the scriptures teach us. And this is the intersect, right? Now, again, this is from another culture, another time period. Another kind of religion actually came up with this idea. This comes right out of Zen Buddhism. Sorry, people are like, oh, you can't use that. Really? Because I believe that God puts into every culture on the planet some way for the gospel to be told. I believe that. I think that's what our job is to do, is to exegete a culture, even our own culture, because we've got so many subcultures now that we would do well to try to understand and exegete culture so that we can find out what is the piece in this culture that we can use to share the gospel with. And for me, this idea of Kintsugi that the Japanese have developed tells the story of broken humanity, That's what this, if I had all the pieces here, I have one of these that's gray, a gray bowl, that I actually, on purpose, just did a terrible job mending. Like the pieces don't match up, there's pieces missing, and it's called I've Made a Mess of Me. I try to fix myself, I try to improve myself, but it just never works. And so that's the gray one. The next one would be the sacrifice bowl, which is the death of Jesus, who pays for my sacrifice. Because of his sacrifice, I'm made into a new creation. When I understand the new creation, then I'm empowered by the Spirit to live a new life. And then there's the fifth bowl is gold, and it hasn't been broken, and it symbolizes the glory of God. And inside that bowl is one of the gray pieces that's missing from that bowl. Okay, so that tells the story. So I'm telling the story of the gospel in a way that is inviting to people. I've had this exhibit set up in many, many secular galleries, and they're so wowed by it's kind of new, we've never seen it, that whole thing. And then they say, well, what does it mean? I mean, I've had conversations with all kinds of people. They're like, well, are the colors do they mean something? It's wonderful to be around artists, because a lot of people never ask the question. They're like, oh, that thing, red, white, and blue is in America. Because I call the whole series Rescue Story, and I actually have matching paintings on the wall that kind of correspond to it, so it's kind of a whole display. But I've shared the gospel in deep and meaningful ways with people, and even have had ongoing conversations with folks here. I was here in YTI 2 years ago. We had a small exhibit set up, and a lady came in, and she wanted to see the work. And so I said, take your time, look through, and if you have any questions, come and ask me about it. So about 20 minutes later, she comes by, she goes, there's something else going on with your work, and I want to know what it is. I said, what are you experiencing? I've learned not to just jump right in. Yes, you're right. Thank you for noticing, right? I just kind of go, well, what do you see? She goes, there's something deeper going on here that I want to know more about. I said, oh, okay. I said, well, yes, you're right. There's a spiritual dimension going on in this work. And I told her, because all the work that you see out there, all those sidewalks, those are just ordinary sidewalks. That's all they are. And they're broken places and broken pieces and things that look awful when I take the original picture, but then I layer them in color. And it's the idea of, again, taking this something broken, something abandoned, something discarded, something that's going to be tore up in a week. I always try to get there before they tear up the city sidewalks, because that's where all my artwork comes from. So I'm taking those things, and then through a process, they're transformed into something beautiful that you wouldn't be able to walk past. And she goes, you think that things can be beautiful after they're broken? I said, I'm counting on it. I said, every single one of these things that you see here is the hope and a prayer that that's possible. She goes, wow, I hope you're right. She goes, what makes you think that? I said, well, I'm a follower of Jesus. And I think his brokenness. She goes, he was broken? Like this is a conversation with an unbeliever I'm having. And it's all over artwork. Okay? And I would have never been able to have this kind of depth of conversation if it hadn't have been for the visual aid, whether it's Kintsugi bowls or artwork or photographs or whatever they are, becomes the avenue by which the Spirit can point somebody to something else. Okay? I fully recognize that this bowl, my sacrifice bowl, isn't going to save anybody. This box, the sacrifice box, isn't going to save anybody. The new creation bowl is not going to save anybody. There's not a single piece of artwork that I do. There's not a single crucifix. There's not a single ever piece of artwork. There's not a poem. There's not any of those things. Music, any song, nothing. None of that can ever save us on its own. But they all can and should, by a Christian artist, point to Jesus. And that's the intersection. We're using the things that God has given us, the ability to be makers, creators, sub-creators, little c creators, to point the way to the ultimate creator. And that's what the goal of all of this really is, and about what YTI is about with their emphasis on theology and the arts. So I'm just honored to be a part of that. Beauty can come from brokenness. But it's really more than that. In the new creation, it points to new creation. So what Makoto Fujimura says in his book, and I'll just put a little plug in for this book, Art and Faith. You can kind of see that. This is a fabulous book, just came out last year, Harvard Press. Makoto Fujimura is a very well-known and famous visual artist, Japanese-American. But he put this together. Again, not a trained theologian, but he worked with N.T. Wright and some others to develop this book. It's fantastic. Has a chapter in here on Kintsugi, but he talks about how it's mending toward newness. So when we talk to people, nobody ever likes to think they're being fixed. Right? We've probably all said that. I've probably said it to somebody like, "Are you trying to fix me? What do you think I am?" You know, right? We just get up. We don't like this word "fix," and then some of us are fixers. Like I've been in ministry for 30 years, right? And I'm like, that's what I want to do. I want to help people. Well, what do help people do? You try to fix what's wrong. That's what we do. But it can be an offensive thing, right? So the term idea of mending toward newness. So these bowls aren't just fixed. They're not just repaired. They're mended and put together in such a way that they become beautiful. And that they become something more than just utilitarian. And I think we have to understand that about people that we're dealing with. We can't just see them as this, like a number or someone that we're just like, well, this is a prospect, right? Can you imagine? Like we used to do that. I mean, my pastor used to give me, when I was a younger guy, like a youth pastor, he'd say, hey, here's some prospects. I used to think, gosh, do they have names? You know, they're just prospects. And we have to get past them to see them as persons and people. So it points us to the new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, the old is gone, the new has come. Right? So we realize that the old is gone, right? The old is gone. And at some point it'll be changed when I get finished with it to be something like this. The new has come. And so this idea that Jesus or Paul talks about here is the Greek word kainos. And kainos means new, but it's a different kind of word than the typical word used in Greek to talk about something that's like new and improved, right? We see that all the time. That's the Greek word neo. So if you see neo-ortho, neo this or neo that, it's a improvement over. That's the kind of new that it is. It's new and it's better, right? But this word kainos is a different kind of word. It literally means newness. It means it's perpetually new. So that the mercy of the Lord is new every morning literally means the mercy of God is new every morning. Okay? And it's not like it's better today than it was 10 years ago. It's the mercy perpetually, and the creation of God, the new creation, is perpetually new. It's the newness. And it literally points to the idea of not simply creating a new humanity, right? Not just a new, improved version of humanity, but actually a new concept of what it actually means to be human. Does that make sense? So you got a new and improved species, or some new concept of what a new species actually is. And that's the word. We are not just better human beings because we have Jesus. He's made us new creations like nothing we've ever been before. And that is a profound, profound truth. Not just restored, not just got the dings knocked out, not just got a new coat of paint, but that brand new, but we're always brand new. Every moment, made brand new. As an artist, I can't get over that. There's no way for me to capture. This does not capture that. I can call that new creation all I want to, right? But that doesn't even come close to understanding the dynamic nature of that. So tonight we've just kind of done an overview of a little bit of Kintsugi, kind of showed you some maybe whet your appetite, but we just really wanted to show you how it's possible to take an artistic art form like these bowls and to talk about faith with it, okay? And I don't believe that I've done any disservice to the art form by doing such, and I don't believe I've done any disservice to the scriptures. I've really done both, okay? Because the church has to come to the place where we can do two things. We have to be biblically faithful, and we have to be culturally relevant. For the last 25 years, we tried to do one or the other. The church has had to pick. Well, we're going to be culturally relevant. Well, when you are so culturally relevant that you don't stand on the word, then you have nothing to offer. And if all you do is faithful to the word, but you don't care about the culture, then you're just preaching to the choir. Okay, so we have to do both. And I believe that it's the art and the artists that can combine with the church to once again give faithful witness in the world in ways that the world is willing to pay attention to us and to listen, because it is sort of the new cultural language is art. And so I hope that that's been helpful to you to see how you can take some concept from the scriptures, unravel it, and then tie it into an art form. And so, man, I just appreciate you folks being here with us, and get in touch with Yellowstone Theological Institute if you have any questions, and I'm sure they'll have some information and ways that you can get in touch with me as well. So thank you for your time. God bless.